So one of the tools I've been spending some time building out over the past couple of weeks is something called Launchpad, and it's my own CLI tool for basically taking my applications and getting them deployed out to my own hardware, right? For my own VMs, my own VPSs. And to kind of give you a walkthrough of how this works, I do have a project I'm going to go ahead and just deploy here. So Launchpad deploy. And what this application does is it's going to look to see if you have a Launchpad TOML file. And this is where you define the services that you want, how much CPU and memory these should have. And also you can define databases, which I'm adding in. And it gets all these services basically deployed out to a cluster that you own. So it's like a lightweight Kubernetes in a sense. Right now, I only have, I think, 2 nodes. So basically, when you try to do a deploy for the first time, it's going to ask you, hey, do you want to spin up an AWS instance, and what size do you want it to be? Okay. And based on the size of the instance, I mean, you can get a decent amount of these different applications deployed out there, especially if you're using like Go or smaller containers. And as you can see, we have one node that's acting as the load balancer, and then we have other nodes that are actually holding the service. So I'm going to go to my application, and now we actually have a new feature that I just added in. So I can do all my deployments directly from my CLI tools. I can ask Claude Code to deploy for me. I can even ask Claude Code to go and grab the logs. All this, basically there's a CLI tool for everything that you can do with your nodes. But the point of this video is not to promote Launchpad. I don't care if you use it or not. The point is I want to discuss some of the architectural decisions I had to make when building this out. So step 1 is I have an application I want to get deployed out, right? So I'll say owltails, and somehow that needs to get on this EC2 instance. Now, in order to achieve this, I basically define a Launchpad TOML file. So I'll say Launchpad TOML, and I put that in the root of my directory. And when I do a Launchpad deploy, it's going to look inside of that directory for that file. And in that file, like I mentioned, it does have a couple of things to find out. So we have like, the service that I want. It points to where that Docker file is for the admin dashboard, the CPU, the memory, how many replicas that I want, and what port it's going to run on. And then also domains. We do have preview domains set into this. So if you want to actually deploy out to a staging environment, a dev environment, or just like a different environment for every PR, that's the main thing I'm trying to build out, is that you can replicate your whole environment with one deploy button. And it's going to spin up different containers and put them as different tags. We'll get into that in a bit. The idea is that it runs through this file. And the first thing it asks you to do is, hey, I need you to create an EC2 instance. If you don't have any nodes set up, it's going to go and try to create one. So like I showed, you can actually list out your nodes here. You can actually create nodes as well. So if you do a node help, it'll tell you like the commands you can do. You can create nodes, you can initialize nodes, you can go and scale them back up if you want to. So the Launchpad CLI is going to basically use the AWS SDK to spin up an EC2 instance. And then also these definitions that are in here, it's going to store them in an S3 bucket. So I do have a S3 bucket that stores all these configurations. In this EC2 instance, I basically used Packer to create something called an AMI. So a Packer to create AMI, which is basically a way to create a snapshot of a running VM so that when it's spinning up a new node, we can just go ahead and grab the AMI and create a new EC2 instance to make it initialize a little bit faster. But the key thing I want to talk about is inside this EC2 instance, it spins up with a Rust agent. So there's a Rust agent running on here that periodically just pulls S3. And it's going to check, okay, I'm node X. I have some definitions on node X that need to run service A, service B, and all the other definitions of like how much memory should they use, etc. What is the domain it should use as well? And the agent pulls these things every so often to see has the configuration changed. And when that configuration changes, or when you add a new service, it's basically going to spin up service A. And then also in this case, we have like another service defined over here for service B. Now, in order to get this working for domains, I did have to spin up a edge. So like we do have Caddy that's running in front of all this. There is a configuration, I believe, that get this all in the same box, but I decided that instead I want to have an edge router that lives in front. So again, this is another EC2 instance that the CLI will spin up, but it's going to install Caddy, and it's going to use a different AMI image that has a little bit less things on it so that it uses less memory. So I have this on a T3 micro, which I believe is like 512 megabytes. And of course, this has a Rust agent too, which is using like very little memory. So again, this agent is also pulling configuration to figure out how it can load balance Caddy to point to my different services. Okay, so Caddy will point to service A, service B. Now, the cool thing about this setup is I can say LDP deploy, and I'll say environment is staging, and that's going to take all the services and it's going to label them with the staging tag, and it's going to figure out a way to put them on my existing cluster. So technically, this whole thing is considered a cluster. And you can have multiple clusters. So if you want to have prod completely isolated from your lower environments, you could potentially do that. So over here we have For example, you could have the lower environment cluster. It's going to have its own load balancer. It's going to have its own EC2 instance, and you'd have to point domains to this separately. But the cool thing about the clusters is that as you're deploying more, for example, staging environments, a dev environment, a preview environment, it's going to look at your current setup. And if you don't have enough space, it's going to go ahead and just create more nodes. Okay, it's going to just keep on creating more nodes so it can actually allocate all of the services that we're trying to spin up. And this is great because now we can actually have like a preview, a dev, webdevcody.com. And this is simply spin up by asking the CLI to do it. And of course, you can run this in CI/CD as well if you want to. Now, to also point out, I wanted to make sure that we have rolling releases. So if you were to have service A on one of these boxes and you want to deploy, version 2, let's say this is on version 1, you want to deploy version 2, the way this works, again, is that all these agents are phoning home to the S3 bucket, and they'll see that a new version of this is getting deployed out. I should probably point out that we do have ECR. So I'm gonna go ahead and just put a database here. This will be ECR, Elastic Container Registry, which basically these services are pulling their images from. So when we actually deploy out a new image, which the CLI deploy command will build the image locally and get it deployed out to ECR, and then it'll also update the configuration in S3, which these services will then pull in. They'll see that there's a new version. It'll go into ECR. It'll fetch that version, and it does a rolling release. So instead of just taking the service down and replacing it, it's going to deploy version 2, and then it's going to point the new traffic using this edge router to version 2, which again, this is using an agent. It's pulling its configuration, and then it's going to configure Caddy over here to say, hey, you now need to actually point to version 2. So all this stuff is basically going to go away. So Caddy will now be configured to, instead of point to version 1, it'll go ahead and start draining that those connections, and then eventually all the new traffic will go into version 2. So basically zero downtime deployments, and I can get all these different things. Like for example, if I go to Forest WebDev Cody, there's an application deployed there. If I go to Battleships, there is a games domain where I can just go one CLI command from my laptop and get this whole thing deployed out inside of an Nginx container. This is like a static HTML file hosted on an Nginx container, and it only requires like 32 megabytes of memory to run. Again, here's the Forest game I've been kind of vibe coding out. So I found doing this has been very useful for my prototyping, but also I do plan to make this production ready and like actually use this for my real production applications. Now, another thing I'm trying to add in right now, these things are just polling like every 10 seconds to see if configuration updates, which can be kind of costly, fetching the configuration from S3 every single time. And so something I am adding in is SQS with SNS. So I'll just say SNS with SQS, where basically when the CLI decides that it's done doing a deploy, it's going to go ahead and trigger AWS SNS. SNS is going to go ahead and trigger all these agents that, hey, there's a new configuration ready. And then these agents are going to go ahead and just pull their configuration, which will then just do that whole process I just talked about. But it's basically a way to make it so I don't have to keep polling every so often. We can just have a topic that we broadcast saying, hey, there's a new deployment on your cluster. The cluster is going to go and fetch its new configuration and basically spin up things and change configuration as needed. This is more of like an optimization to try to reduce cost, because it does cost like 40 cents or something every month to keep pulling from S3, but doing this was very, very cheap. And also it kind of gives you an instantaneous kickoff of your new services. So overall, that's how Launchpad kind of works. If you do want to play around with it or try to contribute to it, I will put the link to the repo. It's public, MIT. I'm going to push a license update for MIT in just a second. But you guys are welcome to play around with this and also contribute to it. I do want to make this into like a legit tool that I'm using primarily instead of depending on third-party services to spin up my stuff and build my stuff. Now, granted, you can also configure this Launchpad CLI to run inside of a GitHub action. So like right now, I'm basically running all this stuff. For example, if I go to Sketchlab, I do have this entire application I've been working on. I deploy this just from my laptop. I don't have a CI/CD pipeline set up. I basically, in Mission Control, I configured a custom script called deploy. Actually, it's not in this version, but basically deploy, and I run Launchpad deploy. But I basically just run this custom script here. I save this, and then when I want to deploy this stuff out, I literally just run this deploy command. It's going to run Launchpad deploy. It goes through and it tries to deploy out my changes to Sketchlab to my production instance. And just to kind of show you that, I can actually make a quick change here. I'm going to go ahead and just go here, cursor CLI. What can we change with this? I'm going to go ahead and just remove the top bar. I don't like the styling of the top bar here. So I'm going to say, can you please just remove the top bar styling? Like, I just want the buttons to be at the top of the page, but don't have like a top bar with a border color and a border rounded. We could even take a screenshot of this thing. Like, just take a whole screenshot of that, and I will just put it here. And by the way, mission control is yet another thing that I've been building out. I've been building out Launchpad using mission control. All my projects I actually use mission control for. So here's all my projects. I have a lot more for my locally running mission control. And if I want to just go ahead and switch to like SketchLab, I can just do this and go to it real quick. I also have it pinned, I believe. Actually, I don't know if I have it pinned. Pin the project. And now I can just quickly switch to it by doing Command 5. Okay, so that is how it works. I'm gonna go ahead and just do another deploy here, and you'll see that down here it's building the new container with the new versions. This will take, you know, a couple of seconds, and then it'll get it deployed out the ECR, and then my services will pull that, get the new version running with a rolling release, and then I'll be able to access it in my UI in just a second. Down at the bottom, it does say it's converging, so it does wait until the new version is fully ready. Okay, it's converged. I can go over here and just do a refresh, and then we should see the top bar kind of go away. I do probably have to clear my cache. There you go. Top bar is gone now. Okay, so that's kind of my process right now. I don't have to go and set up a CI/CD GitHub action pipeline and add keys and do all this other stuff, or I don't have to go into a third-party service like Railway and get that all configured. It's literally, I have an idea, let's just run a deploy command, and it's running on my domain. So yeah, definitely go check it out. I think it's a pretty cool tool. I've been having fun using it and building out, but let me know in the comments if there's anything else you think I should add to it or change. And I hope you guys enjoyed this architecture overview. Again, this is the feature of coding. It's about knowing the high level so you can prompt the agents to implement what you can envision, right? All right, have a good day and happy coding.